everyone. We are back here to talk about ESG regulations and disclosures, and I'm really excited today to have with me Mami from the IRO, Fei from CDP, and David from Aberdeen. So we're going to discuss all about regulations and disclosures, and first of all, we are going to start with an audience polling question. And it is a pertinent topic. What is your biggest challenge in dealing with ESG disclosures? So we have it up on the screen, and you can scan the QR code to give your response. And in a bit, we'll be pulling it up to discuss. So in the meantime, we are going to get into all the nitty-gritty of disclosures. But we'll first start off with governments, because disclosures and regulations are ultimately made by humans, and 2024 has been such an important election year. We have had dozens of elections in different countries, and of course later this year we're going to have a really important one in the US, which my colleagues and I discussed briefly earlier. So ahead of that, I really want to find out what are some of the impacts that the US elections are going to have on ESG regulations and policy. So I want to turn first to David and ask him about what the impact of the US elections would be on companies and stocks.
Nice, easy question to get us started, Sheryl. First of all, thank you for having me here. It's a delight to be here. I think this is part of the 3D chess that investors are playing at the moment as we move into the second half of the year. Excuse me. First of all, how do we think the US election will play out? And that's changed meaningfully over the last few weeks as we've seen changes in the Democrat Party. But also, how should we be thinking about interest rate changes? And the two of those are not mutually exclusive. So looking at the Bloomberg terminal this morning for the odds for the winners, which I just discovered that feature last week, it still looks as though the market believes that Trump will be the winner. And so investors are thinking about what a Trump 2.0 presidency means. Trump has been very vocal in the past around sustainability, around ESG, around climate change, and so investors naturally are wondering what that might mean going into these next 4 years. There's a few things that are on our mind. One, how should we think about policies and requirements? Two, how should we think about initiatives already in play? And then three, anything else that's unexpected. And so some of the things that are on our mind is, what does this mean for disclosure requirements by companies? What might this mean around restrictive regulations around certain sectors? So will we see a loosening of certain environmental regulations? Will we see a loosening of restrictions on oil and gas drilling, for example, is something that's been spoken about? Will we see a loosening of EPA regulations, is something that's been discussed, up for discussion, but certainly something that's on our mind. More actively, I think he's been very vocal about addressing the quote-unquote EV mandate for the car manufacturers on day one. He's talked about that as he gets into office. And so obviously that's something on our mind as investors. The impact of that is open for discussion, given the way that we've seen consumer preferences maybe dial back a bit from EVs to hybrids, for example, in the US, but certainly that's something that's on our mind. And then if you look at maybe the big elephant in the room, the hypothesis around the Inflation Reduction Act and the IRA and what he may do there. And the narrative has seemed to be that we could well see that dialed back. But what I would suggest is we perhaps need to be a little bit nuanced here as we think about the IRA and also the CHIPS Act. They were as much around energy security or security over vital supply chain components as they were around inflation reduction or even climate change. And I think I saw a statistic that 80% of spending on the IRA and CHIPS Act had been in Republican states. And so should we necessarily assume that he would walk those back? I don't think that would necessarily be the case. I do think that if you look at the progress made on certain issues around energy transition, around solar, around cost competitiveness, then there is a force of economics at play here that governments around the world can inhibit or restrict, but which is a determinant in terms of the way that the prices have come down and will perhaps continue to play out whichever government's in power. Now, having said that, it's a long answer, Sheryl, forgive me, but it's a big question. The 3D chess I mentioned is what impact do his interest rates have on this? What impact do Trump potential tariffs have on inflation? Would they be inflationary? And what does that mean for the import of materials from, for example, China? So a lot going on, but I think we need to be nuanced in the way that we think about this.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, so I am going to ask you in detail a little bit later about how you're positioning, like if you're looking at a Trump presidency. But I think it was a really good overview in terms of spelling out some of the ESG-related risks regarding governments and regulation that can hit companies and have a material impact on stock prices. So I want to turn now to Mami to talk about the S aspect of ESG risk. Like, what are some of the standards and developments that are happening globally or in this region that are having an impact on companies that are material? So we're talking about things like fines, like litigation, if there is non-compliance.
Thank you, Sheryl. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me here today. And before I answer the question, may I ask the audience, how many people have heard of human rights due diligence here? Can I have some hands up? Okay, I see maybe 10% of the crowd. I hope this will be the whole team after this session and after this business summit. So companies and investors have a huge role to play on tackling human rights violations through human rights disclosures. Human rights due diligence, which is identifying, mitigating, preventing, and addressing human rights risks within the operations and throughout the value chain. And since 2011, when the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights have been in place, there have been many voluntary actions and initiatives around the world, and guidelines being published by governments, industrial organizations, and workers' unions. And there have been a lot of national action plans by countries, such as the ones in Asia also, including in Thailand, in Japan, Vietnam, Indonesia, and more coming up right now. And coming back to the question, there's also a big trend of mandatory due diligences and regulations that's been in place. For example, the first type of it is focused on the disclosure, such as the one as the Modern Slavery Act in the UK and in Australia, which is more focused in disclosing what kind of preventions and what kind of how the companies are addressing the risks. And then the second one is on the due diligence, more on the process of whether the company has done the due diligence, such as the one in Germany, the Supply Chain Due Diligence Act, the Duty of Diligence Act in France. And the third one is the one that's completely linked to the trade policy, which is such as the one in the US, the UFLPA, Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. And this trend is actually even more accelerating. And this year, especially in the EU, there's the CSDDD, which just been enforced last Thursday. This asks the companies in the EU and those people with the operations or subsidiaries in the EU would be have to comply with the due diligence, and if not, there could be up to 5% of the fine of the total turnover of the company.
Wow.
And there could be some litigations on that the companies, if they haven't done according to the law. And there's also the CSRD, which asks for the disclosure of the DD process itself. And then there's other things coming up, such as the proposal for the EU version of the Forced Labor Prevention Act and the Deforestation Act and so on. So it could be quite confusing, and especially for companies and investors who have operations across the globe. And it is true that you do have to look at your jurisdictions, but it's a good idea to come back to the principles, because all of these regulations are really based on the three international instruments, which is the United Nations Guiding Principles, OECD Guidelines for Multinational Enterprises, and ILO M&A Declaration. And for the human rights risks that you have to be looking into, it's coming down to the International Bill of Human Rights and the fundamental principles of right at work in ILO standards, which is elimination and both abolition of forced labor, child labor, discrimination at work, and then establishing the freedom of association and collective bargaining and occupational safety and health. So I hope these instruments will be your guidance to prepare yourselves for the due diligence regulations that's coming up in place.
Right. Well, that's really a whole slew of measures, and companies really need to keep on top of them to make sure that they're being compliant, right? Or they can be subject to fines and litigation and penalties. So here I want to turn to Fei Li, and we have seen that with more standards and with more regulations, companies need to be actively disclosing it as well. And before we get to that, I just want to pull up the poll results from the question that we had at the beginning of our session. What has been everyone's biggest challenge in dealing with ESG disclosures? And it seems like by far data collection and management is an issue, right? Especially in this part of the world. So Fei Li, talk to us a bit about the regulations and developments that you're watching in this region. And is it going to make the problem worse? Will it be even more of a headache for data collection and management for companies here?
Yeah, many thanks, Shirley, and it's a great honor and a pleasure for me to join today's the events. So I'm a little bit surprised to see the results of this kind of poll.
Really?
Series.
What
so
surprised you?
Yes, it seems that the complex regulations is only ranked the third. So because so I will introduce the developments from the regulation perspectives. So regarding the introductions about the sustainability, even the ESG disclosures, the regulations happening from the Asia region. So based on my observations, I really would like to say we identify three the main trends. So for this area, happening in Asia, the first one is that the mainstreaming process of mandatory sustainability disclosure has accelerated in Asia. So this is especially true since some regulations were introduced by China. So early this year, requiring its listed companies to disclose sustainability-related information with clear timelines. So let me elaborate a little bit. So in this April, stock exchanges from Beijing, Shanghai, as well as Shenzhen, issues their respective guidance on corporate sustainability reporting, which took effect from the May 1st of this year. So more than 400 companies will be mandated to publish sustainability report by 2026. Also in this May, China's Ministry of Finance opened a public consultation on the exposure draft of the Chinese Sustainability Disclosure Standards for Business, which intends to create a mandatory ISSB-aligned sustainability reporting system applied to all the companies in China by 2030. The fundamental sustainability-related and climate-related disclosure standards are set to be introduced by 2027. Now, it seems like almost all the key economies from Asia have mandatory sustainability or ESG disclosure requirements in place. Moreover, the existing sustainability reporting standards released by the individual countries from Asia are in line with or complementing global initiatives or standards such as GRI and TCFD. Since last June, the release of IFRS sustainability and climate standards has renewed attentions on the global ESG regulatory landscape. Currently, the majority of the stock exchanges in Asia plans to introduce new or revise their sustainability disclosure rules, which will align ISSB standards in the near future. Maybe we can take Japan as an example. So according to the requirements of the Japan's Financial Services Agency, all listed companies are mandated to disclose ESG metrics using the TCFD framework by April 2025 under the initial phase of the compulsory sustainability disclosure regulations, right? And Japan's new regulations are expected by 2025, developed by the Sustainability Standards Board of Japan, SSBJ. So in the new regulations, SSBJ decided to align their standards with the IFRS S1 as well as S2 standards.
Right.
Yeah, so although the mandatory data are pending, but the companies can voluntarily adopt those, the standards from April 2025.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that was pretty comprehensive, and what struck me was one of the points you made, which is that we see lots of mandatory disclosure requirements, and we see it in different stock exchanges across the world and in this region. So David, as someone who looks at all these listed companies, does that thrill you? Is it a good thing? Do you have more information now with which to make all these investment decisions? How relevant are ESG disclosures when you're trying to generate alpha?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, one we were just discussing earlier amongst the panel. I know as an ESG specialist, someone who invests with a sustainability mandate in the fund that I manage, we should be thrilled and excited to your point around sustainability disclosures. But as I was sharing earlier, I was looking at a company just last week. We had to do some due diligence on the company, and the sustainability report was 354 pages long.
No.
And was longer than the actual annual report. And so the question as an investor is how much of that disclosure is material to your ability to make a decision on the value generation of a company. And for any company, there will be a certain number of factors that would influence maybe 80% of the outcomes on a sustainability factor basis, and the rest, maybe you have a small tail risk. And so you need to focus on the issues that are financially material for that company, in that industry, in that country, in that jurisdiction, at that particular point in time. And so there's a trend, of course, for asking for more information. And of course, if you ask 10 investors what information they want, you get 20 answers. But I think as investors, we also need to say to companies, to be fair, this is what we really need to make a decision. But then the flip side of that is we probably need more disclosure and more narrative in other more traditional areas. And so I was talking to Fei Li about this earlier. I get 354 pages on sustainability metrics, but how much do I get around the board's thinking on capital allocation? Not really a lot. How much do I get around the board's thoughts around growth, what the sustainability issues that the board is thinking about may mean for the company's strategy and growth over the next 3 to 5 years? So yes, perhaps there's a case to slim down a little bit some of the sustainability report and integrate that a little bit better into the way that the companies are communicating with investors. And I know that this means that some people will think I'm being unfair to our industry, but I think we really need to be fair to companies as well in terms of the information that we're asking.
Right, absolutely. And at this point, let's turn to audience questions. Abby, what do we have?
Have a question. Given China's majority share in critical minerals mining for the green transition, how should investors regard the human rights abuse allegations which plague that supply chain?
Wow, that's a really good one.
You know, it's a spicy one. We're keeping things tense here.
Great. I think either Mami or David can have a go.
Do you want to go first?
Yes, it's a very difficult question. We do get a lot of inquiries from the companies also. According to the principle, we do ask the companies to try to respect the human rights international law as much as you can without being incompliant to the national law. So that's what we're asking. But yes, it is quite a difficult question to answer. And yeah, it's, I guess, you just have to do what you can and try to involve your stakeholders to get the information you need. And yeah, that's from my side.
One of the advantages to being an active manager and not having to hold everything that's in an index is that we can do quite detailed due diligence. And it's not just on the critical minerals that came in the question, it's across the supply chain in a range of industries that relate to energy transition. And so I think it's incumbent on investors to do that due diligence and ask companies these difficult questions as much as we can to get comfort for our clients' capital.
Right.
Okay, we have another one. This one's for you, Fei Li. What kind of evidence is there that companies that disclose using CDP decarbonize faster than companies that don't?
Yeah, this is a really good question, specific to CDP. So many thanks for the person who raised this kind of question. So many people may notice that this year CDP introduced our integrated questionnaires. So this year, we really would like to integrate it climate change, water, deforestation, biodiversity, and other environmental topics into one questionnaire. So hopefully by this kind of approach, so we can help the companies to reduce their CDP reporting workload. But back to the questions, so to this person who raised this one. So I really want to say, so CDP is something, its scoring methodology is kind of scientific. So because we try our best to set, the criteria to ensure, so especially the companies who would receive CDP top scores, for example, A or A minus, as our leadership scores. So we have to ensure they have enough, so the evidence provided with CDP. So for example, the third party, the documents to verify their emission data. And also at the same time, so we did set some cross-check, the questions, so to ensure the companies so provided information through CDP so are consistent. And also, so we still have another very interesting module. So in our questionnaire, it is called the sign-off module. So that means, so if one senior, the leader, so from one company, so for example, the C-suite members who sign off CDP's disclosure, that means this will ensure the high qualities of this kind of response. If just a managing level staff, so they sign off this kind of questionnaire, I don't think that they will be qualified for receiving some scores so from this module. Thank you.
Right, absolutely. And I just want to wrap up also with a question that I'm really interested in regarding disclosures, which is how we see emerging technologies with AI and machine learning helping us out. Because no way we're going to read 354 pages of sustainability report for every company out there. So what are some of the ways in which you have already seen how AI can help us?
I think there's opportunity and risks to using AI. There are some companies with a lot of trials to use AI in data collection and try to use it to identify risks, and human rights risk included. But also we do have to note that there is a risk to AI in terms of privacy. And this year we have the United Nations and the member states have had this proposal about like the AI. You have to have the human rights risk online as much as offline. So yes, there is an opportunity, but at the same time, we have to take care of how the data is going to be used, especially when it's something sensitive as human rights.
I think there's one of the more interesting areas that I've seen is to help investors collect and summarize information from non-traditional data sources. I think that will help us to triangulate what's being disclosed to us by companies, and I think that and the ability to summarize 350 pages is what's gotten us pretty excited, actually.
Right.
And also, based on my observation, it seems like so many companies, especially some consultancy companies, they already apply the AI, this kind of technologies to help the companies to prepare their ESG reportings. I think it is really huge. So the reductions of the cost, especially labor costs, right? But as we discussed, so before these sessions, especially with David, how to ensure, so this kind of data collected by the AI tools will be useful. So for the stakeholders, especially the investors, for their decision makings, I think that's really a big question in front of us to deal with.
Right. Can you elaborate a bit more on that in terms of how you would collect data that is useful?
So David only?
Yeah.
So to me, so CDP is very interesting. So I'm very glad to introduce more about this platform. So I think CDP's questionnaire, especially climate change questionnaire, so it collects, so the most, so the abundant, the climate-related data through our platforms. But how much of them are very helpful to the investors? So I think, still as I mentioned, we have to think of very carefully or further, and maybe AI tools can help somehow to do some screenings or screen out the most important information to our investors. Let me give the floor to David.
So there's two parts to this. One is, how do we ensure that the data being collected is useful for investors in terms of the investment decision-making process? But the second part of this is, when we say investors, who do we mean? Are we talking about active managers, for example? But even within active managers, are we talking about, for example, an equities investment team, or are we talking about what's potentially a quite separate ESG analysis team? Because what's material to one team may be quite different to another team. And so I think it's incumbent on data providers in general to think about what's most material. But I think also it's incumbent on investors to ask themselves, if we've asked for this data point from a company, how are we going to use this data point? Otherwise, you're just a kid in a sweet shop asking for lots of data. What are we going to use that data point for, and how do we incorporate that into our investment process? Because if the answer's meh, probably not, then it's a little bit unfair to be asking for that data point. So there's two sides to the coin. One is on the data providers, but also it's incumbent on investors to really think about the way they integrate these insights into decision-making and capital allocation.
Yeah, absolutely. So data collection and management was one of the key challenges, and it's not unique to companies. We have CDP, we have investors all looking into the same issue as well. And with that, thank you so much for your time. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.